Thank you. Okay, we're live. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining me for part 4 of this new amazing Tanya series. And today's class, we're going to be learning about the 10 Sefirot, which are the 10 divine emanations, the 10 building blocks of creation. And it's such a great time because we are in the Jewish Sefirot Omer, where we count every week the 49 days to to receive the Torah, and there are 7 weeks that we're counting. And each week we're actually focusing on refining and working through one of the 7 emotive spheros. So what is that? Let's go back a little bit. So until now we've been talking about the initial stages of creating the universe. We spoke about initially about Tzimtzum, how before God made a world, there was just the God and an infinity. And God decided to do this crazy thing, which is to create a finite universe with details, a detailed finite universe within his infinite, non-divisive, within his infinite non-divisive self. So to create a finite universe in the infinite non-divisive self, first there was Tzimtzum, and then the first thing Hashem created in this space, where he created in this finite space, was the 10 Sefirot, which are 10 divine lights through which he can contract his light, which is infinite, contract it in order that he can then express to create from those 10 building blocks, create infinite amounts of creations, different types of creations of infinite capacity, humans, animals, plant life, animal life, inanimate objects. So that is the background of the spheres. So the 10s, I like to look at them as 10 divine channels where Hashem channels his light to first condense his light and contract them into 10 channels, and then release them to give them the capacity to create infinite universe with an infinite amount of creations. So these 10 building blocks of creation were then reflected into us when God created us. So in the general universe, the first creations are these 10 channels of light, which we're going to touch on today and go into detail in the following classes. They're divided into 2 categories. There's 3 intellectual channels of light called Chachma, Bina, and Das. Also, the acronym for them is Chabad. And those are called the mothers, because intellect gives birth to our emotions, to 7 emotive attributes. The reason I'm telling you now about the division is because these 7 emotive channels of light are the ones that we refine and focus on during these 7 weeks of Omer, which is the time period, 7 weeks between Passover and Shavuot when we receive the Torah. And each week in Sefirot Omer, we are counting and focusing on one of the emotive attributes. The first week we're focusing on Chesed, which is loving kindness. The second week on Gvura. The third, which is discipline and restraint. The third week with Tiferet, which means harmony, which is compassion and balance, and it's a balance of the first 2 of Chesed and Gvura. That's the first triangle. Then beneath that we have, I'm just going to show you now the picture of the 10 Sefirot. So the first week of Sefirot Omer, we count and we focus on Chesed, right over here, kindness, Gvura, strength or restriction, which is the opposite of kindness and generosity, Tiferet, which is beauty, harmony, which is a balance of the 2. Next, we have Netzach, which is endurance and determination to overcome challenges. Netzach, across from Netzach, we have its counterpart Hod, which is gratitude, which is Hoda'ah, gratitude, humility, devotion. And the end of the triangle of these emotive emotions is Yesod. Yesod is the 6th. Yesod is the foundation. Yesod is the capacity to bond and to connect deeply to others. It's the capacity to create and root ourselves and attach ourselves firmly and plant our roots. And beneath Yesod, which is not in this chart, is the Malchus, which is Malchus. Malchus is a lot of things. Malchus means royalty or leadership, but Malchus has many functions in the human body. Each one has a place in the human body, and we're going to go more into it soon. I'm just giving you the names of all of the 10 Sefirot so you know what I'm talking about. Malchus has a few jobs, has a few functions. Malchus is leadership. It's the power of our speech. It's the power of our action. It's what gives us effective communication and leadership. And Malchus essentially is a receptive space, like the womb in the human body, to receive from all of the other spheres above it. So that is just a very brief introduction. If you have no idea what I just said, that's okay, because we're going to be going way more into it. Each of the spheros is class on its own, but these are just the names. So hopefully you're familiar now with the names of the spheros. We have the 3 intellectual spheros. So now you've learned Chachma, Bina, and Das, and then we have the 7 emotional spheros, Chesed, Gvura, Tiferet, which is So we have Chabad, the three intellectual, Chesed, Gvur, Tiferes, Chagat, and then Nehim, which is Netzed, Holy, Yisod, Malchus. And this chart will hopefully be linked over here. Okay, so let's go back a little bit now before that. So the Sephiros are the 10 building blocks, which we said, which are 10 divine lights, which God chose to create the world through these 10 channels of light. They are not God, but they're 10 divine expressions of different types of light. And when God created us, looking at this first source in Genesis, in Bereshit, we have the very, very beginning of creation when God chose to create us, human beings, to have a relationship with him. He said, let us make man in our image. In Hebrew, it's na'aseh adam b'tselmenu kidmusenu. Let us make man in our image, in our likeness, right? What does that mean, in our image, in our likeness? We learn from there that God actually replicated or photocopied, in my words, or took a photograph of his 10 spheros and put them into every one of us. And they actually have a place in our anatomy, in our body, like we saw in this picture over here. So when we go into the spheros individually, we'll see how they relate to the part of the body that they correspond to. So each one of us was created with 10 human spheros as well. And later on in future classes, we're going to learn that we actually have 2 souls. Each of our souls, our godly soul and our animal soul or our human soul, each are given these 10 spheros to express our soul, so that as ways for our soul to express herself with the world as well. So the basic levels of all human communication, all human thought, and all human emotion is based on these 10 spheros. Now, these 10 Kabbalistic spheros, or in our body, in the human psyche, has actually been brought down in many other schools of schools of like the human personality development. For example, the Enneagram is also very much based on the 9 spheros in our body. Even Carl Jung's theory of the personality types based on the 4 elements of fire, earth, air, and water is very much connected to the source of the spheros. So the spheros are the building blocks of how we communicate as well, how we communicate with the world around us, how our soul expresses herself. All positive emotion comes through chesed, all negative emotion comes through gvura, etc., etc. So every power of our soul, for our soul to express herself, is in these powers. So, and when we talk about them in God's 10 spheros, his ways of 10 expressions or channels of expression, we call them the Sefirot. And in our body, they're often also called the kochos hanefesh, the soul powers. So when I talk about the ones in our body, I'll call them the 10 soul powers. And when they're in the world and how God connects to us, they're called the 10 Sefirot. So let's pause a little bit and talk about the word Sefirot, because this class is titled Sefirot. Most of us probably don't know what the word Sefirot means. So the general interpretation of the word in Sefirot, or translation, is emanations. But there's three more translations, because Hebrew language is so rich that every word shares a root with many other words. So the word Sephira shares a root word with 3 other Hebrew words that teach us that they're all very much deeply connected to one another. So in general, we have Sefirot, which means to emanate, which comes from sapir, which means to light up and to illuminate. It means a light up, to light and to shine. So there's shining emanations. Then we also have this, in this time period that we were talking about, where we're counting the days, the 7 weeks between Passover and receiving the Torah on Shavuot, which also means weeks, because we're counting these 7 weeks. We have the term that we're counting every day, this biblical commandment every single day to count the Omer is called Sefirat Omer, which means to count, which also comes from the same root word as Sefirot, right? So lispor, to count, Sefirat Omer, has the same root word as Sefira. So Sefira is an emanation, an illumination, a shining light. It also shares the same. So we have lispor, to count, Sefira, which means to emanate, to illuminate, and to shine. We also have lisaper, which means to tell over, to communicate, to tell. So when I'm telling you something, I'm communicating to you. I'm nisaper. A sipur is a story. So the Sefirot are different ways of communicating. The soul can communicate her and tell her story in 10 different ways. God communicates with us with 10 essential ways, and those further divide afterwards and create so many infinite amounts of creations. But the building blocks, the 10 essential methods of communication, are these 10 Sefirot. And they work together to allow us to lisaper, to communicate. So we have Sefira, to shine, to count, and to illuminate, and to tell over, and to communicate, and to express ourselves, or to tell the story. So that's the word Sefira. So now we know what Sefirot mean. So let's go back now to what we said, where God said, let's make man in our image. So we have a really interesting question that comes up, because we often refer to God's eyes, God's hands, throughout the Torah and the Bible, there's so many references to different body parts of God. But we are taught from very young age that God is not human. God is infinite. He has no body parts. He has no eyes. So we talk about God's eyes, but God has no eyes. So to understand this, we actually learn that when we speak about, it's brought down that the Chachamim said that when it speaks about God's eyes, God's hearing, God's outstretched arm that took us out of Egypt, we're not referring to a physical hand. Rather, God does not have a hand, but he uses terms in which we can understand so that we can somewhat relate to understand what God did. Because if we would understand what God actually did, if we would tell us the way that God did it, we would have no way to understand it. And that is actually the deeper reason why God chose to make us in his image. Because we can only truly, the same way that we can only truly understand another person's experience, if we is that the only way we can truly understand anyone else's experience is if we can somehow relate it to a similar experience that we've had. That's what empathy is. Empathy is saying, although I may not have had the exact same experience as you've had, I can connect it to something similar that I've experienced, and that can help me empathize and understand an inkling of what you must be experiencing. So if you have the joy of having a child, and I haven't had a child yet, I can relate to that, the joy of having a niece or nephew or a sibling born, and I could somewhat express and relate to that joy. And that goes for all sorts of pain as well. Although we may not have experienced a similar pain, we can hope to be empathetic. We need to reach within ourselves and put ourselves and say, how can I even imagine to experience that by relating it to other similar experiences? And I'm sharing this because God said if we want to have, we have a mitzvah to know God. The purpose of creating us was to have a relationship with God, to be in a loving, romantic, or intense bond with Hashem, and to cleave to God and to be one with God. And the only way we can do that is if we can connect. The way to understand God, to know God, is impossible if we can't relate to God in some way. So God actually reflected himself, parts of himself within us, and actually every single part of the human body, every organ, is exactly created to reflect a certain part of God, so that by understanding ourselves and our makeup and our physical, spiritual, psychological makeup, we can then understand and reflect that back to intimately know Hashem more. And so all the examples of when we say God's arm, God doesn't actually have an arm, but the same way that an arm, right hand stretches out to bring someone in, to give, to pull someone out of a dark place. Similarly, God's attribute of chesed, of kindness, is to uplift us, to bring us close, to pull us in. And the same way we have a left hand, which is sometimes we need a balance, sometimes we need to pull people in, sometimes we need to have boundaries, right? Like to say no. And sometimes we need to put boundaries for somebody's safety and for someone's protection, to protect them, say that's somewhere that's dangerous. Similarly, God acts sometimes with the left arm, and sometimes God acts with gevura, and sometimes we don't understand the boundaries God puts in us. Or sometimes, like a child doesn't understand when their parent says, you can't go there, that's not good for you, you can't eat that, that's not good for you. A child might be devastated, but their parents are acting with love. So too, we can somewhat understand. These are just some examples of when God sometimes has to do something to somebody which seems painful at the time, or feels extremely painful. It is painful, and doesn't. But we can understand where that is the left hand of God acting with God's gvura, with God's strength or God's severity, where he needs to sometimes act like that. And we actually learn that every single attribute in our body, every physical limb in our body, and every organ in our body, every system in our body is actually created as a reflection of some sort of divine expression as well. And that way we say, from my own flesh, I can perceive God. And through creating us in his mirror image, in some sort of image of God, we can now understand and have a greater connection to understanding and connecting to God and feeling a more intimate connection. But that being said, it is not that we're similar to God in any way. We are similar to God, but we have to understand that we are finite, limited human beings, and God is infinite. And even God's expressions within the world to us are sourced from infinity. And I heard once, I need a doll for this. I heard once, just one second. Can I share this doll example in this class yet? My doll. There we go. Okay, I'm back. Okay, so to understand, to talk about the Sefirot and how we have 10 Sefirot of God's revelation above and God's expressions and how they reflect within us, and to understand the differences of how we say that we have chesed and Hashem has chesed, and are they the exact same thing? Is one just a bigger chesed than we have? And to understand how every place in the Torah Hashem speaks in human terms, where we have so many places where it says God's watching us, but he doesn't have eyes, right? God spoke to us. Does God have like a massive mouth, right? And as children, we sometimes imagine God with this huge mouth, or whatever we imagine it. So I actually once heard an incredible mashal, a parable, about a doll. So when we this doll over here, when I would ask my child, what are these? These are doll's eyes. These are Dolly's hands, right? This is all my children's doll since they were little. So if I would say this is the baby's cheeks, this is baby's head, right? So if I would then to go deeper, I would say, we might ask, well, what are eyes? Eyes can see. Eyes are things that we can use to see. Can the doll see? No. And if you would even describe what eyes do, eyes open, they close, right? They blink. All the things that eyes do, this doll cannot do any of them. So why do we call this doll's eyes if they do nothing that eyes do, right? And we could go through every single organ as well. A hand touches. What does the hand do? It feels, it touches, it opens, it closes. This doll's hand does none of that, but we still call it a hand. And every single part of the body of the doll, we call this a hand, but it actually does nothing, has so little similarity to that of a human hand. But we still call the parts of the doll the same terms as we call the human doll. This example is so brilliant because why do we? So let's answer that question. Why do we? So in my understanding, we call the doll's hand a hand, although it doesn't feel, touch, move, or open or close or do any of the things that hands that do, because it has a resemblance. It resembles the hand in a very physical way. And I would never say that a doll's hand is just a tiny human hand, or that the doll's eyes are just tiny human eyes, right? Or a life-size doll is just a plastic human eye, or just, even if we had a doll as big as me, I wouldn't say this is just a plastic version of a human hand. It's actually not a hand. It is just a plastic thing in the form of a human hand. And that is what is meant when it says, let us create man in our image and our likeness. We're not just shrunken down, more physical hands than God's giant hand, or an infinite hand that could do more superpowers than our hand can. It's actually a totally different hand. The doll's hand is this plastic version of the human hand that somewhat resembles our hand physically, but it actually doesn't have even a fraction of the capacities of a human hand. And this is so powerful because it helps us understand that the same way that we call a doll's hand a hand, or a doll's eyes an eye, or a doll's mouth a mouth, even though it can't taste, it can't speak, it can't do any of the things that a mouth does, but it's created in the same image. Similarly, when it said, let us create man in our image, it's kind of that, it's what I understand from this is that our eyes, God has the essence of what eyes are. God sees. When we say God sees, Hashem sees everything that has happened to us, will happen to us, and will ever happen to us. Hashem sees everything. There's nothing hidden from God. God and just sees everything. So Hashem has the true sight, and we have the doll version of sight, right? We have a finite, limited, very limited form of sight, which resembles somewhat what God's sight does, right? Our eyes can see in a limited capacity what it was right in front of us, right? And so the same way that our eyes can see what's somewhat in front of us, that resembles somewhat, like the doll hand resembles what our eyes can do. Our eye is a very, very limited form of what a true godly eye can do. So if we, instead of imagining since I heard that, instead of imagining a giant eye that just sees more, right, has like ultrasonic vision, I now realize that my eye is a very finite, limited level of sight that God created in his wisdom so that I can actually live, a normal life, right? And without being flooded. If I can see everything was happening all the time, I wouldn't survive a minute of that, right? It's like, even if we could hear other people's thoughts, right? So God created us perfectly the way that we're meant to be, but also to understand. So that helped me understand more when it says God's outstretched arm, right? We have the finite version of what an arm is. Our arm can do kindness and can feel and touch in a limited capacity, and God can reach out and lift every one of us in a moment, right? God is not limited the way we are. Hashem could,
yeah. Like he has a hand. He's like,
yeah.
Us. Then like, no, we're like him.
Right. God is not like us, but bigger.
Right.
He's the original.
Right.
And so I always imagine myself now as like the plastic doll version of God. And that changed everything for me. So it helped me understand now in the Sefirot as well, that is exactly what it is. So we have the image of the Sefirot. So let's move on to the next mashal. So hopefully that helped us place it more about the physical way that we reflect God's image. And to take it even further, does anyone have a phone? Can I use your phone for a minute? So here's Jackie in front of me. Jackie is the real version. I'm gonna put your fingerprint. So we have Jackie, the real version. And so this next example is gonna help us understand now, taking it to the Sefirot, how there's a few questions we're gonna have. So God, it says, created every one of us and imbued every one of our souls with 10 soul powers. Just like God's Sefirot are not him or his essence, they're 10 ways of expressing his infinite light in a channel, in a definitive, in a defined, more divided, I don't know, like distinct, divided.
It locks really quick.
What?
It locks very quickly.
Way. So similarly, Hashem created within us, each one of us, these 10, gave our soul. Sorry. spectrum. Our soul is also a pure, infinite piece of God. We have in our soul infinite piece of God, and our soul is then given 10 Sefirot or 10 soul powers to communicate its infinity with others, because infinity can't be communicated. But if you can then not dilute that, direct that, focus that into something more finite and more limited through those 10 expressions, the soul can now communicate with the world and communicate with its body and with those around, those that she meets. So yes, the soul is feminine. So one of the questions that is given is that, are all of us just mini replicas of God? What makes us all unique and different, right? Where are our differences just in our bodies, and our souls are all clones of God because we all have 10 soul powers? Are all of them exactly the same? Or are there other things that make us different? Or are the 10 soul powers exactly the same in all of us? Or is there a difference? So just like in personality types, we learned that there's 9 personality types or 10 personality types, or the Carl Jung has like the 16 personality types based on the, right? So we actually learned that there's an infinite amount of personalities. Our personalities come from our 10 soul powers, or part of our personalities come from our 10 soul powers, which also stem from our personalities also come from our 4 elements. And this is actually going to tie into the 4 elements in a moment, but maybe in another class actually. So we actually learn that although every one of us is created in God's image, none of us have the exact same balance of the 10 soul powers. There's an infinite amount of ways to mix up the soul powers, the sphere in ourselves, so that each one of us comes out uniquely different. And every one of our souls expresses herself. So our souls are infinite. Our souls are all godly pieces of the same God, infinity. But so we do come from the same place. We're all one being. We're all part of one being. And that's how every human being is created, is from the same, is one. We all come from the same source of light, but our soul's expression is different in every one of us. So this is where it gets cool. Although every one of us has all 10 of these soul powers to reflect God's 10 spheros, nevertheless, every one of us has more emphasis in some of the sefirot more than others. So some of us will find that we are much more strongly drawn or emphasize our personalities much more of chesed personality, which is and others will be a gvura personality, and some of us will be a tiferet personality, and we'll all find ourselves identified with some of the sefirot much more strongly than others, and other sefirot will find to be challenging for us or to be harder for us to access or tap into. And the reason for that is pretty cool, or an example to illustrate that is pretty cool, in that we have the real life Jackie in front of us. Let's turn the camera to see the real thing. Okay, we don't have to. And then we snap a photo of Jackie, and that's the photograph, right? So we snap the photo. Show the photo. There we go. The photograph is not the real thing. And I think that's what's really cool. When we say, let's create man in our image, this is before there was images of people. So the real thing is God. We're the image, right? So we're the finite image. The image is not you, but it looks just like you, but it's a very limited, I can't talk to it, right? So we have the image of the 10 spheres inside of ourselves. But what's really cool is that I can now replicate this photograph in millions of ways. It will all be the exact same photograph image of the original Jackie right here. But in each image, I can change the pigments of all the colors in this picture, so that in each copy that I create, there'll be an infinite amount of color combination, so that some will have a stronger blue pigment, some will have stronger in the white, and will be the exact same photo, but with different concentrations of pigment. And in that way, I understand, that's my understanding of the Sefirot, that, and I actually heard this example from, read this example from a book by Rabbi Matzis Cantor, and I don't remember the name of the book, about the 10 Sefirot many, many, many years ago. And I love this example. And so going back to this chart of the 10 Sefirot, so all of us have all of these. We're all an exact image of God, right? Not the real God, but the image of it, like the photograph, which looks exactly like it, but is not it. And in this image, all of us, and each one of us has a very unique combination of pigments or concentration in some of the Sefirot more than the others. So some of us will have an extreme concentration in chesed, right? A little bit of netzach, very little in gvura, more or some. And there's an infinite amount of ways that you can concentrate and have a combination of all these Sefirot. And although we'll possess all of the Sefirot, we will have a focus and a stronger connection to one of them, and it will express itself, and we'll be expressing ourselves much more through one of these than others, or a few of these more than others, or in different times, different places. And I don't think it's like, I don't know the word I'm looking for in English, but I don't think that it's in one sefira for every part of your life. I think it's more complicated than that. I think that every one of us find that in some different parts of our lives, we find that we are expressing ourselves more through one sphere than another. So let me we'll break down what the spheres are in more detail, because they definitely deserve that, and we deserve that. Let me see how much more time we have today. Doesn't tell me how much time we've done. It's kind of annoying.
I like seeing now how the Enneagram, where the Enneagram got everything.
Yeah, but I've done a lot
All
of
from this.
times to connect the Enneagram to the Sefirot.
Yeah.
It's not exact. Like it's hard
No,
to
it's not
find.
exact,
Not
but
exact, but it's
What you're saying, like
it
the different
connects, yeah.
combinations of the different
yeah,
ones and the dominant one.
right. Okay, so let me see what else I want to talk about today in this class. Anyone know how much time we have? If you go on the YouTube button that I shared, you could see. Do you want to do that?
Sure.
See how much time we have. So I want to know what to
Like
focus.
how much time have we been going
Yeah,
already?
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Okay.
Newly.
Something that's really cool to note is that there's two verses at least in the Torah where it says that God created us in our image. First, in the verse in chapter 1, verse 26, which we already quoted before, that God said, "Let us make man in our image, in our likeness." And then the next verse says, "And He did." Vayivra Elokim es adam b'tzalmo. And then God created man in His image. B'tzelem Elokim, in the image of God, God created him. Zachor nekeva bar osa, male and female created them. What's interesting is that the word "selem" is the same word in Hebrew now as modern Hebrew as silum, a tmuna, a picture, right? Matzlema, a picture, a photograph. So in that way, it helped me understand a lot of the Sefirot. How much time did we do so far?
25 minutes.
25 minutes? Okay. So rather than go, okay, so the Sefirot in Kabbalah are referred to as the tree of life. If you ever heard of the tree of life, it's referring to this image of the tree Sefirot, right? Although in this area it's a body, in the human body, in the soul powers, but in how they are above, it's actually the tree of life. It's the tree of life. It's the source and the building blocks of how God created and breathed life and communicates into our world and continues to. Now, in this tree of life, in the following classes, we're going to go into each of the Sefirot and talk about what they are and how we relate to them and how they impact our lives and all the amazing ways we could grow through them. But for today, what I do want to talk about is the three branches of this tree of life. So can I grab borrow your pen? No, it's fine. So the tree of life, let's imagine that take away the human body. It looks exactly like this. If you always see the Kabbalistic image of these exact circles, concentric circles with lines connecting them, right? With little lines connecting them, then you have the tree of life. It's like a diagram. It would look like this, right? So thanks. Right? You have these lines connecting, and then you end up having something that looks somewhat like a tree. So in the picture, in the thumbnail of this picture, you have this tree of life. So now what's the connection to a tree? So just like a tree has multiple branches, we learned that even though there's 10 Sefirot, they're actually branched into three main branches. There's the root branch, and then the right branch, and the left branch. And what's amazing is that we learned that as our soul descends into the world, our soul passes through this tree of life, and it receives from each of the Sefirot as it passes through the tree of life. But some souls remain, right? It's like the gestational period that the seed of the child remains in the womb of the mother for 9 months, and it develops in that stage. And this is the development of the soul as it comes down into this world from being just an infinite piece of God and then coming into our body. It passes through this tree of life and of all of the Sefirot and all of the worlds as well, which we talked about in last class, the 4 worlds, right? And as it passes through, some souls spend more time in one of the branches than the other branches, and some souls spend more time, meaning develop more in one of the Sefirot, and that's where we receive our individuality from. And the prime example of this in the Talmud is 2 famous Talmudic teachers called Hillel and Shammai. Hillel and Shammai lived in the same era. They were 2 huge, tremendous, brilliant scholars, and very often there was disagreements between the 2 of them, halachic Torah disputes between them. So, for example, on whether or not something's permissible, there would be the school of thought of Hillel and the school of thought in Shammai. And it was very well known until today that if you study Talmud and you open it up, you see very often from the beginning, if you open up Maseches Nida, the first page says Shammai paskins like this, Shammai rules like this, and Hillel, the base Hillel and base Shammai. Base Hillel tends to rule almost the majority of the time to be more lenient, to permit things, and to be more lenient with halacha and to be more permissive. And Shammai tends to rule almost the bulk majority of the time to be much more strict. And it's brought down in Kabbalah that those who were able to understand souls and see souls knew that the reason for this spiritually was that Hillel's soul stemmed from the right branch of the tree of life, from Chesed, which is called the Chesed branch, and Shammai's soul stemmed from the Gvura the Gvura side, the left branch of the tree of life, which means that as their souls developed, as their souls descended into this world, Hillel's soul passed through and developed the most in the right branch of the tree of life, in the Chesed branch, where we have Chesed, kindness, which was permissive, which is generous, but very, very generous, not looking at details, not so calculated. And Shammai's soul stemmed from the opposite side of the tree of life, from the extreme left side of the tree of life, which is Gevura, which is called the Gevura side, the left branch of the tree of life, or they're also called the lines, the kavim, or the lines or branches. So these are very important to, even before we get into the individual spheros, to understand the three branches actually gives you tremendous insight into what the individual spheros are. Because although they are differentiated, in the right side we have chesed, netzach, and chachma, they're very connected to one another. They're actually, the root of them is, they have the similar root, while one is intellectual, one is emotive, and one is more practical and action-based. And on the left side, we have Bina, Gvura, and Hod, and they are all very much similar. They share so many similarities, but Bina is intellectually based, Gvura is emotionally based, and Hod is action-based or action-driven. So they're all very similar. And so when you understand when you learn more about the branches and the kavim, but as they're called, the right kav, the kav yamin, the kav small, which means the right kav, the right line, the right branch, the kav small in Kabbalah, the left branch, and the kav emsa'i, the trunk, the middle trunk, the balance beam, right, so to speak. Then you really understand the spheros in a much deeper capacity. Throughout Kabbalah and even Talmud, there'll be a lot of references to somebody's soul stemming from the right side or the left side, and that will reflect a lot in a person's tendencies and where he gravitates towards. Does a person gravitate more towards being generous, being outgoing, being sociable, being optimistic, or is a person more gravitating towards being calculated, more cautious, more inhibited, and a little bit more introverted? And all of those things, or in the way that they think, are they constantly, are they someone who speaks a lot, or somebody who thinks a lot, or is more more involved in their inner world? Is there somebody who is more forceful, or somebody who's more shy, right? And those are just some of the many, many tendencies that may reflect in a person, and you may pick up on depending on where they're from. And now on the middle branch, those are the two. The capacity, the tendency to be generous, to be outgoing, to move outwards is from the right branch, from the kava yamin, and the tendency to move inwards, to be more calculated, to be more cautious, to be more limited and finite, to be more limited and not just speak a lot, right? And to be more calculated and thoughtful, even with money as well. That comes from the left side, from an extreme left. And nobody is one or the other. We're all a very big blend, and it has a lot, and our who we are is not just about where our soul comes from. It also has to do with how we were raised, the families we grew up in, the environment we grew up in, the different conditions we were brought up with. So there's so many different, and there's a spectrum, right?
Like right brain, left
right brain. It is very much connected, right? We learned that Chachma is right brain, Bina is left brain. That's where they're found in the body. And there's so many more factors to it, but this does have an effect, and we could find some sort of pattern, but there is a spectrum, right? Nobody is fully extremely chesed except Avraham Avinu, who was the epitome of chesed in our world, and Yitzchak Avinu, who was the epitome of Gvura in our world. So most of us are a blend of, or somewhere on the spectrum. And right in the middle, we have the Kava Emsa'i. The Kava Emsa'i is the balance beam. It embodies Da'as, which is in our neck, Tiferet, which is in our inner chakra, I guess, right? The
heart.
center, so the heart, right? The heart center,
Heart,
of the heart's lung center, and our Yesod, which is our foundation. So in the Kava Emsa'i is our capacity, is someone's capacity. If somebody's from that Kav, they'll find themselves they may find themselves to be a very balanced person, somebody who has a lot of empathy, a lot of connection, a very personable person, and someone who has a lot of charisma as well, because knowing exactly when to speak, when to pause, when to share, when not to share, when to wait, when to listen, that is a very endearing quality. So there can be a lot of charm there, and there can even be like in the negative side of that, if somebody would use all of these traits could be used for the negative, it would be like the extreme level of manipulation, knowing exactly when to speak, when not to speak. It's a very deep, deep people as well. It can give the capacity for a lot of depth through the das. So in the center line, we have a lot of balance, a lot of harmony, someone who knows when to give, when to permit, when not to permit. Someone who's a balance. It's towing the line. That would be the extreme center, right? And everyone is somewhere on the spectrum of right or left. But often when someone's an extreme right or an extreme left, not with politics, but with our soul source,
Any extremes.
extreme, then we'll find that you'll be able to easier see where your soul stems from. But it's really interesting to be able to be in touch with our soul, see where our soul comes from, which side. And I'm going to end with this, that often we discuss refining our Sefirot, right? In Sefirot Omer, we are taking each week, beginning with Chesed on the first week of Passover, and then Gevura, and we are working through the Midos. Now, here's where it gets really cool. When you look in the Siddur and you're reading Sefirot Omer, you'll see that each day you're not just working on Chesed, Chesed, Chesed on the days, on the whole week of Chesed. You're working on the first day, you're doing Chesed, Shebe Chesed, Chesed of Chesed. The next day, you're working on Gevura of Chesed, right? Tiferet of Chesed. What does that mean? So here's where it gets pretty, you know what? I'm going to just delete this and I'm going to do this next week because it's such a big concept.
No, but you could just say like.
Okay, so I'll say it. So what's amazing is this. Okay, so this is where it gets really exciting because when God initially created the world, we learned in Kabbalah that when God began creating the world, there were previous universes that God made before our universe. And those did not work out, to say the least. They exploded, they shattered. And the Kabbalah has two main reasons, and the one of them being that each of the Sefirot, God made the 10 Sefirot, but they were each standalone. They didn't have these lines connecting them. And each of the Sefirot were created with Chesed was fully Chesed, Gvura was fully Chesed. And what happened was that the Sefirot couldn't tolerate one another. They canceled each other out. Chesed is kindness, Gvura is severity. One Chesed is water, Gvura is fire. And they canceled each other out and they couldn't live with one another. And that's where the world shattered and everything fell to pieces, right? If we live in a society where every man is for himself and everyone is just, I am me and you are you, we will cancel each other out, right? We'll swallow each other alive. And that society, that world shattered. So when God recreated the world, it says he did tikkun. Our world is called the world of tikkun, the world of fixing. And when tikkun in our world, God fixed it by creating, when he said, I'm going to make the Sefirot this time differently. And I'm going to create every Sefirah with this incredible concept called inter-inclusion. In Hebrew, Hiskalus Hamidos. They're each going to include all of the other Sefirot in them. And that's the only way that we can survive. And it's the only way we can grow as people, and that's the only way we can live in a healthy society. So when Hashem created Chesed this time, Chesed included within it all of the other Sefirot, and Gevura included within it all of the other Sefirot within it. Gevura has Chesed, Gevura, Tiferes, Netzach, Hod, Yesod, and Malchus. Every one of the Sefirot includes all of the other ones, and this is very much connected to a incredible theory called the holographic universe theory by, I believe, David Baum, where they did this crazy study and they found atoms interacting with each other faster than the speed of light. And what they ended up discovering is that every atom includes within it every other atom in the universe, and that our entire world is a hologram or holograph. That every single cell includes all other cells and all other organisms, because the Sefirot, which build up our world, include within it all the other Sefirot. So if we truly get to the core of something, so that is how the two cells or atoms or neurons, whatever they were across the universe, were interacting with one another so quickly because they were part of the same exact organism. They were part of the same one. They were just split. What?
Each piece has
the whole in it. Yes, it's a crazy theory, and it kind of like helps you understand this theory so much more. And therefore, when we work on our midos, right? When we work on midos, often we think that if somebody finds themselves to be an extreme chesed, right? They're very permissive. They say yes to everything. They have no boundaries, right? We'll find that we struggle a lot, right? So for example, I feel like I'm more on the right side of the tree of life. And I find that I have a hard time saying no. I take on too much and then I don't follow through. I overachieve, or I say yes, and then I can't deliver, right? I overpromise, underdeliver, because I want to just say yes. People pleasing, all those things that can come up with being too much, with being so much on the right. So you might think that what I need to do is move towards the left, right? I have to just balance myself out by moving towards left. But we actually learn is that God made us and gave us the qualities that we need to live our best life, to do our unique mission in the world. We are given exactly and created exactly the way we're meant to be. So we don't need to grow by changing who we are, by saying I need to say no more, right? I need to be more gevuradik, I have to be more strict. We don't have to be different or change our essence or change our makeup, because we were made exactly the way we need to be to affect the world in the best way, to light up the world. We were here to do tikkun olam, to be nitzosos, to make to light the world up, right? To take all of the darkness in the world and turn it into light, to light up our environment, to bring more kindness and goodness into the world. And the way to do that is exactly by defining and understanding where we shine, where our Sefirot shine the brightest, and then using those to light up the world the best they could be. If I were to diminish my chesed, right, or my right side, then I would be diminishing my Sefirot, my light, and I wouldn't be able to effectively light up the world. So I don't need to diminish my chesed or make my chesed smaller or make my gevura smaller. If somebody is a gevura,
That.
if somebody is so strongly gvura, they might think, well, I have to be more chesed. Well, we don't, because you are made this way so that you can light up the world through your light. So to diminish your gevura would be to diminish your light, your sefirah, your light, the way you light up the world. So what we do need to do sometimes is that often if we find ourselves, we do need it, some people pleasing and all of these traits that can come across that can be, harmful to ourselves and painful to ourselves and others. The way we work through them is not by diminishing the chesed, but rather by cultivating the full breadth of our chesed. So if I need to learn to practice more gevura and more boundaries and learn how to have a lot more boundaries for myself and others, what I will then do is cultivate the gevura through my chesed. I will grow and expand my chesed by developing and cultivating gevura within chesed and gevura within all the other traits I am strongest in. And that is the beauty of Sfiras Omer. So when we're counting the Omer, we're saying the first day I'm growing and refining and working through and shining up and lighting up my chesed of chesed. The next day I'm working on my gevura of chesed. The next day my tiferes through my chesed. And when we have gevura, chesed and gvura, it's different. It's how I find my chesed through the main sphera that it is, which is gvura, and they're all very different, and we'll get into them later on.
Okay, yeah.
But that's really tell me more. But that's a whole nother. That's for next class. Next class we'll hopefully begin with the spheros. We'll see how many we cover, depending how much time we have. But this is just the taster, the teaser, the background. This was the Sefirot 101, Sefirot 101. What are Sefirot, right, with our names. We covered what the name Sefirah means, the 10 Sefirot as they are as divine emanations, divine channels of light, how they are reflected within our soul powers and our bodies and our soul's expressions. And we even covered the 3 branches of the tree of life, the 3 main core branches, and even covered this crazy big concept called Hiskalos Amidos. But we're going to obviously go more into depth into future classes. But thank you so much for joining, and can't wait to see you in the next class.